So we want to go ahead and welcome everyone to our third virtual TAMA Talks presentation and our first in a series of talks happening each Friday in February. The topic of these talks will be famous artists, and we'll be joined each week by Max Presneill, an artist himself, who is also the director and curator of the Torrance Art Museum. And Max will share his insights on the work of these artists and will answer questions from those tuning in. I'm Janine Madden, the Torrance Art Museum Advocates, or TAMA for short, president, and it is my pleasure to open our series by discussing the work of Mark Rothko, a suggested artist by TAMA's secretary, Susan Hubert, who is joining us today. I'm going to provide a very short biography of the artist only because we really want to maximize the time that we have with Max to answer our questions and hear his thoughts on the work. I will put this resource in the chat at some point, but I would direct you to the markrothko.org website. They have a very detailed biography as well as many, many examples of his work. He was born in Latvia in 1903 and he immigrated to the United States in 1913 when he was 10, where he and his family settled in Portland, Oregon. It was there in Portland, at the Portland Museum of Art, where he had a one-person art show in 1933. His style of art before World War II was quite different than the work that he produced after the war, and then also, again, very, very different than the work that he produced later in his life. He was heavily influenced by surrealist artists like Juan Moreau and Max Ernst, and ultimately joined ranks with other artists of the time to include Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still, Willem de Kooning, and Helen Frankenthaler. And he became a painter in what we now refer to as the abstract expressionism period, where art really had no reference to the material world, but was quite expressive, quite highly expressive and emotional. Max, do you want to interject before we really start, or do you want to kind of get us started on how you think this is going to go today?
Well, I want to just make it clear for these talks that I'm going to be participating in these as an artist and as an audience member, just looking like, as everyone is, not as an art historian in any way, or really as a curator either. I think it's kind of interesting to sit and try and figure the way through the paintings as we're seeing them and try and find ways to understand them. The other thing I'd like to point out, that I think it's a really excellent opportunity to try and get to an understanding, while knowing that out of all the artists I could possibly think of, I think Rothko is probably the absolute hardest person to try and understand his work through an image instead of the actual work. It really is completely contradictory to everything he stood for. So this will be an interesting person to start with in trying to get to some understanding.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and look at a piece that when you look at it, and I'm interested to hear Susan's perspective on this, when you look at this piece, Susan, would you have, other than being a fan of Rothko, would you have ever guessed that he had done a piece like this?
No, no. In some of his early works, you have to know something about him and his life to see how, where, and why the transition happened and how things became simpler and simpler and simpler and more emotion packed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I included this only because of that. Oftentimes when we're out and we're at a gallery or something and we're looking around and we're trying to find that artist that we really, that the artist whose work we really enjoy or relate to or can recognize, if you saw a piece like this, you may think it would maybe be a Moreau or something, not a Rothko or not a work done by him. And so this piece is called Slow Swirl at the Edge of the Sea and was painted in 1944 and as an example of his early work. And if you strip away the figures, You can see those influences of Miro in the background, some of those um, just pieces of color and the line work and the swirls, things that we sort of associate with Miro when we're looking at a piece. And then if you take away all of it, you do kind of just see those two distinct color fields. And I included this piece really just because I've always been intrigued by that, like Susan was saying, that progression of work going from an artist's very early work until they can come into their own, or they develop so much so that their work becomes really quite different.
It's interesting that that I think sometimes people forget when they see an artist's work, they think, oh, it seems very simple. That most artists progress from learning to draw and figurative work and really getting quite good in that area into more difficult areas to explore. And if they go through surrealism, this ability to learn to trust their own instincts when there's no guidebook or no direct, illustrative equation there, that you can see that through this period for this artist, that getting to the kind of mature stage of his work, which I think some people would think of as being really quite simple, it's quite complex set of stages to get there.
Okay. Um, I put this photograph in as well just because I loved it gives us a feel for the size of his work, which is very, very large. I also just love, I don't know, I loved everything about this piece, but I loved the chair and I loved all of the kind of hominess of it. I loved the fact that he was covered in paint, but that his chair isn't.
You can also see that he has music playing and a bottle of bourbon.
Does. I was going to say there's cigarettes, and I'm not sure if you're on full screen, you may be able to pick up all those details. But yes, it was just sort of like everything that you needed. It was the back in the day version of your ear pods. So we're going to go ahead, and we have a bit of time. We're going to watch a short video.
Rothko in his paintings always sought to achieve a certain drama. The entire decade of the 50s is spent at this point where he moves to an inward state. He moves to a place that is really seeking to create something pure, essential, and thoroughly contemplative. And this is a period from which he never returns. It completely shifts the remaining decade of his career. Rothko was an artist who was constantly interested in color theory. He was interested in how the colors and the forms interacted within the expanse of the canvas in order to provoke an optical experience for the viewer. Now, in his earlier works, Rothko played with a variety of different contrasts and tonalities. There were bright oranges, reds, blues, purples, and the interplay between these different colors is what really created the power and the majesty of his work. Now, in 1958, Rothko's whole palette transforms into the darker, more somber, meditative palette intended to provoke in the viewer an immersive, completely awe-inspiring event. And in Black on Maroon, we see Rothko begin embarking on this entire conceptual project for the very first time. When you stand in front of this picture, the title in itself is misleading. It is not black. In fact, it is such a deep and rich and almost indefinable array of colors within these, what he calls black forms. It's blues, it's rich dark burgundies, it's blacks, it's grays, all of these colors fuse together to form the very optical experience that Rothko is endeavoring to create. In 1958, Mark Rothko was invited to paint a commission of murals for the then Four Seasons restaurant at the Seagram building. His initial intent was to completely cover the walls of the Four Seasons restaurant to create a completely immersive environment Eventually, Rothko infamously declined to present the murals to the Four Seasons restaurant. The very depth and emotional core and profundity of the paintings moved Rothko to such an extent that he couldn't see them placed in any kind of commercial environment. The Seagram murals marked this point in Rothko's career where the paintings moved ever more inward, and simultaneously so it became for the viewer. When you stand in the room at the Tate amidst the Seagram murals, you focus as much on what surrounds you as what's inside of you. When you step into the room, your eyes have to adjust to the colors on the walls. It's not dissimilar to the experience one has when standing in front of black on maroon. It evolves over time in your eye and in your mind. It's something that is constantly moving, yes, because of the colors, but also because of the brushwork. It was in these paintings from the late 50s where Rothko almost seemed to accelerate the velocity of his brush. It's ever faster, which is what creates the kind of feathery nature of the zones of color within this painting. These are zones of color that are not static at all. And even in this picture, they seem to have a vertical lift. They seem to be rising upward. There's a magnetic force in this picture, which I think is accentuated by the reduction in the colors. It's a painting in which the zones of color abut one another, but are constantly pushing and pulling, advancing and receding, interacting with the foreground and the background as much as they are interacting with the viewer's eye. What's exciting about this painting is that it distills the entire drama, power, and impact of a room scale installation that the Seagram murals were intended to comprise into a painting that is much more human scale. Rothko intended for his easel paintings to be proportional to the human body. This is that. This is a painting that when one stands before it, you are able to recognize yourself inside of it. You can enter it and experience it, and yet it resounds with the same kind of visual power that an entire room of the Seagram murals invokes.
All right. So we are going to go ahead and Max, do you want to comment and start us off, or would you rather get some feedback first?
There's a couple of things I'd like to point out from that short film that I think it might be worth noting, is because he didn't say explicitly that Rothko demanded certain very low lighting levels for his works, and that in itself, his awareness of the need to set the stage, as it were, for the experience is telling on how he thought the works might work, and the relationship between the viewer and the work. That he needed them to be lit in a certain way. He didn't mention that explicitly, but these were demands that he would make. The other thing that I think is worth noting is about the titles, because you talked about the title. These don't have titles. These were descriptions given so that people could differentiate works from each other. But he deliberately didn't give them titles so that there would be no way for the viewer to extrapolate a potential meaning or maybe an associative link to something outside of the painting. And so he didn't title them so that there was only the painting to look at. There weren't distractions to do with, because titles can do that. They can give you a kind of a clue, as it were, into meaning. And he very much didn't want there to be any clues, that there was only one thing that mattered, and that was the direct experience that you could have in front of them. I think it's important to note this, because these little points about his work are very important to how he sees how they function, as it were.
So just from the folks that are gathered here, if you'd like to go ahead, and you can either use the chat feature if you want to unmute yourself, or if you'd like to just go ahead and speak. And again, I'm gonna default to Susan only because she does have a strong interest, but What is your sort of visceral reaction when you see a painting like this?
Are are you asking me?
Sure. I'm asking everybody, but I know that you can.
It's the body of his work that I find so intriguing. How he did in his early work, he did do some. They're almost like pictographs, but they're linear. And then I think it's more about him, his paintings, than the viewer. His paintings are, he's boiling down his own emotions, his own his own reaction to what's happening to him. He has an emerging period, he has a joyous period, and then he has a despondent period that leads ultimately to where his work is so dark. You must find out what's happened to the man. And he committed suicide, I believe. There was a death in his family that just the joy was sucked out of his work. And I think Max said something about the light. Yes, it's very important if you even if you have a Rothko print, where you put it, so it catches the light that accents. I happen to have one from his joyous periods. Obviously, it's a print, but otherwise I'd just be sitting there looking at it. I'd never move. But it's very important how the light catches the depths of his works, and you really feel like you're tapping into another human being, going behind his eyes. I don't know if I'm rambling or making any sense, but I
No, I think
have a
it's
great deal of feeling and surrounding his works when I see them, especially if you see the full scale.
sure in person. Absolutely. And so Max kind of was talking about that. Let me move to another piece. Or would you rather me go to this piece?
I think,
His life
yeah,
is becoming sad.
Yeah, so if you look at this work and then this work, so in the 50s, his work went from what we saw earlier, right, to very, very abstract, working on very large canvases, and started to move into what they call the this color field work. And like Susan and Max were both saying, it's really a reflection of mood and how you're feeling that comes through on the canvas.
You just look at that and you can almost feel your put your own experiences in life into that. Those silly things, a picnic, I don't know, a fun family event, a new child in the, you just look at his stuff and you can like communicate with him just through the blocks of color. I'm rambling again. I should mute myself.
No, you're good. That's what this is about. So, okay. So, Max has put a quote in the chat.
okay, so it's a rather long quote, but there's a couple of things in here which I think are key. One is that he refused the title of abstractionist in any way, which means he thinks that these paintings work in a literal fashion. All right, it's important. These aren't abstractions of something. I think that they have ambitions of mythology, and they see themselves as being metaphorical in some ways, etc. But for Rothko himself, I think these are very, very literal and direct. They are emotional, spiritual, transcendent um, uh, um, opportunities. And these are things where you can stand in front of them. I mean, he famously said you should stand like 18 inches in front of them. So essentially, so you were lost in the visual field. Um, but what is going on for these people who approach them is what he felt, which is there is he says the same religious experience, but I think he means religious experience in terms of the sublime. He's talking about the possibility of reaching the most essential for him aspects of being human that there are, which is it's all about death. It's about God or whatever other name one comes to this with. I think it's interesting that him and many of his contemporaries were Jewish and had an idea of God as not being a specific being necessarily. And I think that the road to abstraction helps with that, because it gets away from the traditional Christian art tradition of figuration when it came to religious themes. And so it kind of took a different track, a track that I think was really interesting and reflects his personal story. But I think the way that one needs to be really, really clear about his work, that he talks very explicitly: tragedy, ecstasy, doom. There is a portentousness about this that I think is really important, and it is exactly about the grand themes in art, what they call the grand themes, which are death, life, etc. And I think it's he had immensely huge ambitions for what he thinks his art can achieve, which is typical of the time, because in that abstract expressionist moment, there was that belief that one could achieve these kind of heights. Now, remember that way of thinking about art has gone through many arguments about whether the possibility of that. So that would be, for us living today, these would be things which we might critique his position about. I think that we also have to recognize historically, without being a historian, that this movement that he was going off on is similar to a lot of abstract expressionists, and he's generally kind of grouped under a wider umbrella, but he had very different aims and ways of getting there than many of them. And he follows a line which, in terms of his work, or at least he forges forward, which maybe Clement Greenberg, the critic, followed, and talking about post-painterly abstraction rather than action painting or abstract expressionism, in being able to talk about the ability of just paint to do something in itself. And I think he's following that kind of logic that paint can act in direct and meaningful ways without it being about something distinct, but it can cause an experience which can be of the sublime, in ways that maybe some artists had tried to use epic landscape paintings, for instance, to get to that same sense of sublime. Just really quick, there's another thing I think is important, because the guy was talking about the brushstrokes. I think that the scale has a lot to do with the idea of them even when they're quite small, they have an epic feel. So they have this grandiosity about them. But I think what happens with the brushstrokes really that have these hazy edges is, one is it makes them have a certain fluidity, and as if they're oscillating slightly. But I think more importantly is they establish the painting as a liminal space. And what I mean by that is it's not quite here and it's not quite there. I guess ways of describing that would be like when you're just waking up and you're still dreaming, but you kind of know you're in your bed. You're not quite dreaming and you're not quite awake, and there's that liminal space. These things, I think, function in this way of in somewhat of uncertainty about where they are, and I think that helps us to see them as a portal to certain ways of having an emotional experience. And he can do that by once suggesting depth with them, and at the same time rejecting that, because he emphasizes the flatness of the canvas. So it has this dichotomy where it is doing both at the same time. It both is a window, but it states its own flatness as a constructed painting at the same time. And I think it's a really interesting that he can manage to pull that off. Anyway.
No, I think it's good. And interestingly enough, many of the things that you just said, for whatever reason, and maybe it's just because I've heard you talk to us as a group of docents, but do you prescribe to some of the things that you're talking about in your own work as well, or no?
I share he actually once made a seven-point statement about, it's a formula for what he thought art should be to make the best art. And I agree with his 7 points in terms of how I approach my own work, but I have a very serious kind of conceptual, intellectual difficulty with some of his assumptions about how art can function. In his understanding, which is of his time, art can be this direct experience that would be universal, as an example. Now, my critique of that is, what does universal mean? If I have a very different experience of life than somebody who grew up in rural China, are we going to see the same thing when we look at that? When we know that to look at Rothko means that we're learning the language of modern art, and we're learning how to read it in some ways. Would that other person have the same experience? I'm convinced that that's possible, because I think culture is learned languages, and that would be in opposition to the idea of something being universal. So I do think there's some difficulties there. I also think that you have to ask what is subjectivity, because he would talk about losing the ego to just enter these things. How can you lose the ego when it's the ego and your subjectivity is the only way that you have of interacting with the world, the only way that you have of understanding it, interpreting it, etc. So I think you can use languages, whatever they might be, to describe the world to yourself and ideas in the world, but the only way you can ever do that is through this subjectivity, which he would disagree with both.
Sure.
I don't think he thinks that language would be important, and I think he would have thought that the loss of ego is extremely important. And I don't know how you would be able to make art without it either.
Sure, because then it would be like purely disassociative. You're very disconnected and
Yeah, I mean, how does one start even understanding what art might be without a context? I mean, the art in itself, any kind of art, is always contextualized for its understanding. So I don't know, like when we look at cave paintings, we say, well, it's probably art. It might be ritual, in which case it isn't art. They're totemic objects that have a function. But but we still don't know what anybody thought of it, because we don't have any trust that there was a universally shared way of interpreting them in the first place.
I want to give folks a chance to ask Max any questions about the work or anything that we've talked about today. We promised that these sessions would be only about 30 minutes, which when you're talking about such a vast amount of work and something so complicated goes by very quickly, and has gone by for us. We did start a little bit late. I guess the big question I have is, do you feel that it is important for those looking at art to have some degree of understanding about the artist? Meaning, if you didn't know from Susan's perspective about Mark Rothko and his life and the decline and his suicide, and you just stood in front of this piece, would it affect you the same way? It's kind of about label reading too.
Yeah, I think that there's at least we all share a common enough culture that I think we probably might well have a similar kind of reaction to it, maybe. But I don't know how important it is to know the bio, as it were, to understand them. But I do think that one of the things that people underestimate, people in the art world and people outside of it, is, and as many of the people here who've been members of TAMA and have been volunteers at the museum, when we do the walkthroughs, one of the really interesting things is, if you kind of open yourself up without, just look at something, trust your instincts, and kind of say, well, you know what, maybe it's this. Mostly people are correct. The times when they're wrong is when they say, well, I see dolphins. No, you don't. There's no dolphins here. But if people kind of open themselves up and just, it's kind of doing this movement, and I feel a bit like it feels dangerous, and it feels this seems very like a fugue state, and there seems to be something bigger here. Then you'd be right. I think these are the experiences that the artist wanted. I think where it gets difficult is in trying to kind of maybe latch on to what those experiences might actually be. But from the artist's point of view, it's irrelevant. I mean, it's like if somebody says, this recent thing that we're living in a matrix-like, AI construction. And I was reading about this the other day, and I thought, well, even if we are, it makes no difference. It doesn't change the way that you subjectively go through the world. Correct. And I think it's a similar thing in as much as we can trust in having this experience, and even if we don't know all the details, there's only one way of experiencing the painting, and that is essentially as a subjective experience.
Right.
And by that, I don't mean that all interpretations are valid. They're not. Right. And I do think that the more knowledge you have about something, the more you can read into it, the kind of quality that's there. I mean, knowledge is power, and it can help really inform the depths of the work. As Suzanne mentioned, he committed suicide, and there is an argument by some people that his paintings turned towards these darker paintings, and that some people have read that as essentially a series of suicide notes, because he didn't actually leave a suicide note. But I think it's really interesting that if he believed that these were truly emotional states, that they got darker and harder to read and less differentiated, I'm not sure how one couldn't read them as suicide notes without being so literal that it's just like, there, he did these and then it led to this. It's always more complex than that, of course, with outside influences and things happening. But I don't know how you could read these without knowing that the bio obviously lends itself well to this darkening palette and the edges becoming thinner and the separations between the colors, etc. So I do think that there's, the more you know about them, the more interesting they get.
And that's really the goal of what these TAMA talks are supposed to be. So we kind of had a two goal. I mean, I think that people who are drawn to the artists that we're going to be talking about today, Rothko, next week a different artist, and after that a different artist. But we also wanted to do exactly that, is to provide a little bit of background. And again, I didn't want to turn it into a biography of him, but I think listening to your perspective and listening to your interpretation to include a critique, which I think is really important, because there are people who, will, I'm sure that you have heard this often, and I'm sure it creates a visceral response in you, but this idea that, oh, well, my 5-year-old could have done that. And it's disheartening to hear that when people say that about abstract art or work like this that's very, monochromatic, or they don't quite understand the complexity of it. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, was to kind of, it's like a little love letter to say thank you to our volunteers and the TAM docents who have really kind of stuck with us through the closure of the museum, and also just to kind of expose them. And it's funny, after I said famous artists, I was like, we could probably do a whole talk on who decides what's famous and what isn't. And so we'll probably have that.
Breaking up.
I know, I just got a little message. Am I better now? Hopefully I'm back on. Let's see. Well, let's try. Hopefully we're not. Okay. Am I back?
You're back. Yes.
Okay, good. Well, that's good, because we are at the end. And let me just go back, because I just have a little piece here at the end I wanted to say. Am I still going?
Yes.
Great. I wanted to thank you all for coming. Next, we will be featuring the work of light and space artist James Turrell next Friday. And so hold on to that Evite link. You can always shoot us an email, and we're happy to resend it out if you don't have the Evite still. And I will try and figure out a way to go ahead and resend that to everybody with a change in artist, so that if you need that link again, you can retrieve it. The Torrance Art Museum has a significant quantity of virtual work available on their website, so I just wanted to give them a quick little plug at www.torranceartmuseum.com. TAMA exclusively supports the TAM, and so feel free to, I know today is mostly members, which is actually great. We're really happy that so many folks in TAMA decided to come today. And feel free to share that Evite link. You can share the link itself or the actual invitation with whoever you'd like. So, anybody have anything that they want to say before we log off?
Thank you for hosting this, Jeannie. I mean, this is really brilliant.
Oh, well, like I
Well
said,
done.
we were really trying to just kind of decide how best to reach out to members and keep them, keep them in the loop as best we could. So this worked out great. And thanks, Max. I know that your life is probably has a lot, your plate's probably pretty full. And I think, did you say you have a show coming up? Did I see that on Facebook?
I had a solo show that just opened in Australia, and I have another show opening in March here in LA.
Excellent. Well, when you share that, we try to do the same on the TAMA website. So please keep us posted on what's happening and what you're doing. We're really interested in it, and we will see you next week.